right, so yeah, localizing social vulnerability in the Portland metropolitan region. What is the SVT project? Social Vulnerability Tools Project, funded by RDPO, managed by Metro, which is the MPO in the region. Creates regional and county-specific data, including indices, sub-indices that are aggregated up into the overall index, indicators that are used as inputs to the sub-indices, and ancillary data that gets into more categorical detail than what was used as original inputs into the index development process. What are the goals of the project? Come to a common definition of social vulnerability for the region, identify communities that may experience barriers to emergency services and programs before, during, and after disasters. As you can see by that second sentence, and specifically the second part of that second sentence, that it is pretty generalized when it comes to a sense of risk. It's kind of risk agnostic, any disaster, any phase of any disaster. And so there's lots of different communities that are affected differently by different disasters and different phases of the same disaster. And so by nature of that sort of risk agnostic approach, it ends up being a bit of a generalized social vulnerability index. There is some budget pending. There's a desire to drill down into more risk specific approaches and start evaluating, like looking at urban heat specifically or wildfire risk specifically, and sort of going down those rabbit holes. But for now, it's pretty generalized. And the silver lining of that, though, is that this approach and the outputs, the indices and sub-indices and indicators can be used for other purposes as well, besides just emergency management. So, one of the talks that I gave was sort of geared more towards public use of the deliverables, not as much from sort of the emergency management point of view, but looking at representatives from CBOs and researchers and whatnot that might want to use this for other purposes as well, such as grant writing or something like that, or just understanding the areas where they're providing services. And so that's kind of the silver lining of the generalized approach is that it can kind of be used for various things. Purpose of localizing the index. Why are we doing this? There's other indices out there. Lots of people have done this. And so, one, rather than just accept some national top-down federal approach to a definition of social vulnerability, to sort of go back to the drawing board, involve community in the process, and evaluate these assumptions about who should be included in this process. And then importantly, also, just in terms of the mathematics of sort of what's going on underneath the hood, is that the approach allows the scale of analysis to vary. And so if you do it at the regional level, you get a certain set of sub-indices based on the relationship between indicators. If you switch that to county-specific indices, then you get different relationships between the indicators and different sub-indices. And so it's sort of more responsive to the data itself than, for example, CDC's SVI approach, which is more sort of prescriptive about which indicators should fit together and that kind of thing. It identifies alternative data sets to augment the fuzzy census survey data as well. So, LEP, for example, is a pretty small percentage-wise, a pretty small population that you're trying to measure in a survey. It's easy to undercount that population. It's also easy to have not a great sampling of the population and have high margins of error. And so bringing in Department of Education LEP data to sort of reaffirm the patterns that we're seeing in the region and reaffirm the distribution of total LEP in the region. And so just finding other data sets to sort of provide other lenses to vulnerability or reaffirm some of the patterns that we're seeing in existing indicators in the census data. 5-county geography, Columbia, Washington, Multnomah, Clackamas on the Oregon side, Clark on the Washington side. Currently, census tracts are the base geographic units. Again, budget pending, we'd like to expand that to census block groups, zip codes, neighborhoods. When you change the geography, though, there's a relationship between spatial resolution and categorical resolution. So categories being like the categories of demographics in the data. And so if you want to get more precise categorically and like measure, instead of total LEP, maybe looking at specifically Spanish LEP or something along those lines. So that's sort of increasing categorical resolution. Or if you want to increase spatial resolution, such as going down to block groups instead of tracks, the lever is that generally when you increase spatial resolution, you lose categorical resolution. When you decrease spatial resolution, you gain categorical resolution. That's kind of the trade-off, right? And so hypothetically, going into this, I would expect that if you did the same process with block groups, you'd probably have less input indicators, but you'd have more spatial resolution. If you back out to zip codes and neighborhoods, you probably, you definitely have less spatial resolution, but probably greater categorical resolution. And so that would be kind of one of the other benefits besides just having different geographies that you could look at it with. So the process that went into all of this, the indicator selection process on the left, starting out with sort of a qualitative process to build out a list of candidate input indicators. And that involved community engagement, both the community advisory group and technical advisory group. And then your standard, research, literature review, what are other indices using, that kind of thing, and sort of building out this candidate input indicator list. And then developing some quantitative thresholds to sort of screen which indicators should be included based on the uniqueness of the indicator, the reliability, and the significance of the indicator, significance in terms of how much it correlates to one of the sub-indices. And it was a bit of a back and forth between the development of the quantitative thresholds and the community engagement. So we involved them in helping flesh out what those thresholds should actually be, and sort of had a little bit of a philosophical roundtable, so to speak, on dialing in that reliability threshold. We initially started out being kind of conservative in that threshold of wanting to have more tracks be more reliable, but ended up, with community feedback, kind of relaxing that. The central philosophical question was, how much signal do you need, and how much noise are you willing to accept, or how much margin of error are you willing to accept? And, there's sort of two levers to that as well. I won't get too much into the weeds, but you have sort of your reliability, the MOE, or the coefficient of variation reliability threshold. You can relax that or make it less relaxed. And then the other lever is how many geographic units need to meet that reliability threshold. And so we relaxed the reliability threshold about as much as we could. And the only other lever we had was like, all right, how many geographic units need to meet that reliability threshold? Originally started off at like 50%, way too conservative, way too many indicators getting screened out. And then iteratively, relax that back to 1/5, but when you think about it, 543 tracks in the 5-county region, 1/5 is still over 100 tracks. That's still a significant amount of the region being mapped by that indicator. And so I ended up feeling pretty good about that, and sort of liked where we landed with this central idea of, we don't want to disappear vulnerable communities that may be showing a little bit of signal that's better information than no information. And so that's sort of where we landed with that. And then removing indicators based on those thresholds, creating sub-indices of similar indicators. And then those sub-indices are aggregated up into the overall index. Again, risk agnostic, so not putting any weighting on any of the indicators or weighting on any of the sub-indices, because we haven't decided what we're measuring against. We don't know what is, and so assuming that we're not sure what's going to happen and what effect it may have, just treating everything equally. How is the SVT structured? At the top, you've got an overall index, then you've got your sub-indices and another data set, and the third data set is the input indicators. It has the estimates and the MOEs and the CVs in there. detailed ancillary data. So again, I kind of hinted at this, but at the beginning of the process, we kind of discovered that the indexing process was really difficult to interpret and make sense of if you had really detailed input indicator categories. And so we kind of backed out, and instead of like providing all the individual race ethnicities and providing all the individual LEP languages and really specific age breakdowns, we kind of went with more general indicators such as total LEP, total BIPOC, under 18, over 65. So kind of bigger categories, but the detailed ancillary data gets into this, which is the level 4 on the right. Greater disaggregation of income, language, and race and ethnicity. I could see this area getting expanded in future years. This is going to get updated annually in February. We did just do a 2023 update in May to sort of catch us back up to the most recent demographic data. And then in each February, we'll update. And so, you know, as the years go by, I could imagine there being more detailed data that gets added to this. Level 5 is from the 2020 census. It's just population, but it's at the block level, which is literally like a city block, except when you get out to rural areas, they get pretty big. But, you know, even in the rural areas, the blocks are significantly smaller than the tracts. And so wherever you're at in the region, that block level population data is going to give you a more spatially precise sense of where people are actually living within the potential tracts of interest that you've identified. And then level 6, which I could also see getting expanded out, is ancillary point data, which provides more spatial and sometimes categorical precision. Right now, we've got mobile home parks in there and nursing homes as well. Data sources, 2/3 American Community Survey, and about 1/3 from various other sources, including census, the census decennial data, as well as census response rates, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, sort of health-related data, Department of Education, educational data related to race and ethnicity and language, Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data, that's the point-specific data. Metro put together or compiled the voting turnout data. And then one that's not listed on here also is CDC Healthy Places data. And so we use that to get at a sense of sort of chronic health conditions. That one actually ends up getting screened out of the process due to not significantly loading onto any of the sub indices, but we do evaluate that data in the process. Data caveats, all of this stuff is really fuzzy, is pretty much what this slide should just say. It's all real fuzzy data. Indicators and indices are estimates. The ACS, or American Community Survey, has the margins of error. It's a survey. And then some of the other data that I mentioned, like the Medicare and Medicaid data, that originally comes in at zip code level. The educational data comes in at school attendance boundary level. The voting data is voter precincts. And so all of that data is getting remapped back to tracts in order to be a part of the index process. And we're doing that using the distribution of single and multifamily housing units, which we have a really precise layer for based on tax law data. And but anytime you do that, you're introducing some fuzziness into the data as well. So this is what the overall index is looking like. Index score from 0 to 10. It is ranking tracts. It's not a count of the vulnerable population. That's one of the first questions that I've gotten before. You know, how many people are vulnerable, and that's a really difficult question to answer when you have so many sort of potentially intersecting percentages from various demographic communities that you're including. And so if you have, you know, 7% of one and 12% of another and 17% of another, you know, what is the number of who's vulnerable? It's a tough mathematical thing to get at, and would involve you know, some level of assumptions. about the degree of intersection or overlap between those estimates. So that's a PhD rabbit hole for me to go down someday, maybe. But right now it's not an actual count. It's a rank, and it's not a measure of magnitude either. So a 10 is not necessarily twice as vulnerable as a 5. A 10 is near the top of vulnerability in terms of the 543 tracks in the region, and a 5 is near the middle of vulnerability. So it's maybe approximately the 222nd, most vulnerable track, roughly. Again, all of this being fuzzy data, it should be sort of interpreted with a sense of a bit of fuzziness as well. And so I think kind of breaking things into, quantiles, which is what I've done here, specifically quartiles, where you kind of are looking at the top quarter and, second quarter of tracks and third quarter and bottom quarter, sort of breaking it into these bigger bins of vulnerability. So we've got the sub-indices here: socioeconomic sub-index in the top left, race and ethnicity sub-index in the middle there, household composition sub-index, aging sub-index, group quarters sub-index, and female sub-index. In the community engagement process, gender definitely came up quite a bit in terms of thinking of candidate indicators. Unfortunately, the census and the ACS doesn't really collect good data on the multiplicity of gender that we understand today. And so it's still kind of just aggregating things into male and female. ACS did recently start collecting data on same-sex spouses or partners, and we did evaluate that indicator, and it was really noisy, high margins of error, and didn't meet even that more relaxed reliability threshold. But that may change as they refine their survey approaches in years going forward. The household composition sub-index, I just want to touch on that. All the other ones are kind of all mapping in one direction, that where you have, higher percentages of a certain set of indicators, you have a higher score in the sub-index. The household composition sub-index was the only one that went in two different directions. It had two groups of kind of inversely correlated indicator sets. And so in kind of the downtown area, in the high urban density area, you've got higher percentages of renters, lack of vehicle access, female householders with no spouse or partner present. And in the rural, suburban and kind of rural areas, you have higher percentages of children and larger families. And so you kind of get these kind of almost this donut thing going on where you have, sort of the medium density, medium-sized families kind of being at the low end, and both ends of that spectrum being at the high end. And so demographic indicators are provided as that level 3, and these are looking at the ones that are all a part of the race and ethnicity sub-index here. And so, if you were focusing on an area that had higher scores in that sub-index, you could drill in kind of one more layer and see, all right, which tracks are popping up across each of the indicators that went into that sub-index, and then detailed demographic layers. So maybe you identify that, LEP is really driving that race and ethnicity sub-index in that particular area. Then you could drill in a little bit more into the limited English proficiency. And I'm just showing the top 5 for the region here. There's more available in the data. And then down to that level 5, the population data. This is a rural tract out in Columbia County. I guess relative to Columbia County, this would actually be one of its urban tracts. This is around the city of Rainier. But any of the tracts out in the more rural areas tend to be larger. And so this just gives you more spatial precision to understand, like, all right, this might be a tract of interest, even though I don't have all of those demographic characteristics mapped across each of these blocks. I can get an understanding of where more of the people in this tract are living in terms of focusing outreach or efforts or investment. Excuse me. Level 6, the mobile homes, more spatial detail than was provided in the ACS. The nursing homes, more spatial and categorical detail. The nursing homes in the ACS are bundled in with the group quarters indicator. And so again, I can see this being an area that gets fleshed out more, where we're also pulling out other sort of infrastructural, facility type information to understand where people are living. Regional areas of interest, we've got I'll walk through these. Rural Columbia County, Forest Grove, Cornelius, Beaverton, Tigard, East Vancouver. I didn't make this correction, but was informed in my last presentation that this should actually be sort of technically identified as Central Vancouver, and me not being quite as familiar with the area, just sort of put the wrong geography on it, and East Portland and Gresham and rural Clackamas County. So if we look at each of those areas, you kind of see different sub-indices correlating more highly with these, or showing up more highly in each of these areas. So for rural Columbia County, we see that it's higher in socioeconomic vulnerability, aging vulnerability, and group quarters. Going south into Forest Grove and Cornelius and West Hillsborough, we see socioeconomic, race and ethnicity, aging, and group quarters. If we move a little east into Beaverton and Tigard, we see the socioeconomic kind of drop off, and the race and ethnicity, aging, group quarters still remain, and then female kind of come in. And this, kind of makes sense a little bit when we think of just the different patterns of sort of immigration and the different industry and jobs that are in different areas in Washington County. East Vancouver, again, Central Vancouver, greater than regional sub-index averages for socioeconomic, race and ethnicity, aging, and female, which is the same as East Portland and Gresham, kind of matching up in these two areas. And then out to rural Clackamas County with socioeconomic household composition, again, the higher percentages of under 18 and larger families, aging and group quarters. And all of these geographies were, kind of arbitrarily selected. I think you could break this probably into a couple different geographies and focus on them more specifically. This really large tract down here has literally about 60 people living in it. And so this is an example of where you'd want to use that block level population data to get a better sense of where people actually live. It's like 95% forest land out there. So some use cases: prioritizing neighborhoods or areas, hierarchically exploring vulnerability, exploring intersecting demographics, and geographic narrative building. So prioritizing neighborhoods is kind of what I was showing you before with the quartile breaks, breaking things into sort of thresholds of on the left, we've got the top 20% of vulnerability, the highest areas of vulnerability, and sort of being able to sort of review or filter the amount of investments or outreach or whatever it is that you're doing by that geography. In the middle, we have the top 20%, top 30%. And so just being able to sort of set some screens and some thresholds on that, where you could focus additional analysis or efforts based on those geographies. The hierarchical approach is kind of what I walked through with the slides of, if you identify some tracks of interest in the overall index, and then you drill down a layer and identify, all right, what's driving that overall score, and figure out which sub-indices are kind of more prevalent there, and drill down again, which indicators are driving that, which detailed demographics and which population blocks are the highest in there. So just kind of working down through the data and getting more detail as you go. And then the intersecting demographics, all of these examples I intersect with socioeconomics. I think that is kind of a useful approach. This is looking at race, ethnicity, the top quartile in both the blue and dark blue, but then the dark blue is where it intersects with the top quartile of socioeconomic vulnerability. And so, one thing that came up in the community engagement process is it's often not the community characteristic itself that's driving vulnerability. It is oftentimes the intersection of that characteristic with socioeconomic vulnerability as well that's really exacerbating some existing conditions. And same thing with aging. There's some really affluent older populations in the region, and there's some much less affluent areas like that. And so we're seeing that intersecting here of aging vulnerability and socioeconomic vulnerability. And not surprisingly, Columbia County really pops out there, as well as some other hotspots throughout the region. And then here, the intersection of household composition and socioeconomics. It's hard to see the few dark blue tracks that are right downtown south of Burnside. And that's getting at that, high renters, lack of vehicle access, female householders with no spouse or partner present. And you have, a lot of subsidized housing down there. And so you're getting that intersection of the household composition and socioeconomics, and in the rural areas, some areas that have larger families and higher percentages of children that intersect as well. And then the last one is geographic narrative building. So here I've got the ETRs, the emergency transportation routes overlaid, the previous intersections, race and ethnicity and socioeconomic vulnerability on the left, aging and socioeconomic vulnerability in the middle, household composition and socioeconomics on the right, and intersecting that with the ETRs and being able to tell more of a nuanced demographic story of which investments are serving which communities throughout our region, and being able to almost kind of take this very quantitative approach that I guess started out as kind of this qualitative approach to the quantitative, and then almost bring it back to sort of a qualitative narrative building, where you can start to tell a little bit more of a story with this data that we pulled together. Potential refinements. This top one has been sort of front of mind for a while, performing some of the quantitative screens before aggregating categories. So as I mentioned, kind of had a methodological fork in the road at the beginning, where we threw everything in, all the individual really detailed categories, really messy, really hard to interpret, not sure what's going on, backed out to more aggregate, larger, broader categories, and then applied the quantitative screens to start screening stuff out. And I just wonder how things would change if you put some of that quantitative screening at the front end, evaluated each of the LEP languages, for example, based on their reliability, and then maybe Spanish LEP makes it in on its own instead of just having total LEP, and then maybe you aggregate all the other LEP categories into kind of an aggregate other LEP or non-Spanish LEP. And so curious about testing out that process, including indicators related to built and natural environment and specific risks. So really, right now it really focuses mostly on the who, not really the where or the what about the sort of the natural or built environment. There's a little bit of gray area with some of the indicators, like multifamily is one of the indicators that we assess. So that's kind of getting at a little bit of the what. But that ends up getting screened out because of how much it correlates with renters, and they're very highly correlated. So multifamily doesn't end up making it into the final set. And then the specific risks as well, being able to cater this more towards, specific disaster, potential disaster risks, and build those into the indicators as well. And then expanding the available geographies. So those are kind of areas we're looking to go into. Here's some links. I'm actually just going to throw these links in the chat, and I just want to show the tool really quick, if I may. So I'm going to throw this. This is the tool link, and this is the data link. Currently the tool is being updated. I think it's going to get published tomorrow with the 2023 update. So it'll look a little bit different, but the functionality is largely the same. And so yeah, the Explorer kind of looks like this. You've got your overall index at the top. You've got some sub indices here, and if you click on an individual tract, you get a sense of how that track relates across these sub indices to the region, and then you can drill into the individual indicators as well, and see all of this data that's in there. One of the refinements that will be available, tomorrow or Thursday, is right now when you are clicked on the indicators, you don't actually see the indicators over in this bar chart. And the refinement on the slightly modified version is that you'll actually be able to explore these indicators in the bar chart as well. And you get this little table down here where you can see the actual selected track percentage to the tracked average. You can also look at a little spider diagram and sort of see if that is visually makes more sense. You can also select multiple tracks by hitting Shift, and I don't know how I zoomed in that far. And then you can also select this little halo button up here and just sort of draw your own geography and select a bunch of tracks and sort of see how they relate to the regional average as well. There's some ancillary data layers that you can bring in. So for example, if you wanted to, look at city boundaries and focus, maybe on just the city of Gresham, you could have a sense of what that is and be able to draw your polygon kind of roughly to that to sort of get a sense of what the city of Gresham is looking like overall, and then maybe some specific tracks that you were interested within that and make some comparisons there. And so in the sort of public training that we did, I sort of focused on using this tool more for sort of grant writing purposes and being able to get a sense of percentages of different indicators in your service area. But yeah, this is a good kind of introductory way to explore the data and get a sense of what's going on. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
So I have a couple of questions, but I'll wait for, I want the program committee members to do theirs first, but I have questions, so go for it, Robin.
I have one too.
You don't want to go first?
I can go first.
Go for it.
How does someone, say a city planner at Gresham, wants to use the social vulnerability tool and they have questions or need some guidance on how to tease out a specific data set that they're looking for, who do they contact for help? Would that be you, or do you have somebody else on your team that they would contact?
For now, it's me. Yeah.
Okay.
So I've given this talk dozens of times at this point.
Right.
I jokingly said last time that I gave this talk that I think I hit my peak of quality maybe 30 talks ago or something, and I might be decreasing in quality now. But I think I'm pretty good at providing the overview and getting into the details. And I've given the talk on request, not the talk. I've given more catered trainings on request to individual teams and departments. Okay. So I'm really happy to do that and spread the word and keep spreading the word. I also got the final review of sort of the web page language, I think tentatively approved, but we kind of landed at a good place. And so in the near future, there should be a website where there'll be sort of some additional information of sort of methodology, all the candidate indicators that were evaluated and why they didn't make it into the final index and all that process. And I think it would probably be useful on there. I haven't generated it yet, but I think it would probably be useful to have some templated little tutorials as well of like, this is, if you're a GIS person and you have ArcGIS Pro, this is how you approach the data. If you're not a GIS person and you're using the online tool, this is how you sort of use it. I think with the online tool one, it might be best just to make a video and put that up there or something like that. So there'll be more information like that. But in the meantime, just reaching out to me and I'm happy to meet with anybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. You kind of already started to answer one of my questions. I was going to say, I thought I heard you were going to make a website that was kind of like a hub for launching the Explorer, as well as explaining the data and methodology, like you said. I was curious if you knew when that was going to happen, but if you don't have a timeline yet, that's cool. But just curious.
Yeah, so I sent a really detailed draft and it was way too technical. And so I got some help kind of revising that down to sort of a more public friendly version of that. And so we landed at a good sort of compromise last week with that. And so I think the communications person now is just doing one last final screening on their team. And then it's going to go to the web desk and they're going to create the site. So I'm hoping, I'm shooting for June.
How exciting. Yeah.
I was shooting for May, but everything always takes longer than I think it will. And so now it's June.
Yeah, I understand. And then I think Laura's putting in the chat. It's confusing me because it says I put this in the chat, but I think Laura's writing in the chat. As a reminder, this meeting is recorded, and I'm happy to take an edited version where we cut out all the meeting and only have your presentation. And we can put it on our YouTube channel for you to easily share.
Yeah, I've also recorded a bunch of the presentations as well.
Yeah.
And so I might take you up on that offer and maybe send my other recordings and you could maybe pick one of because like the one that I did for the CBO, like the public one that had more CBO representatives and whatnot that were present. I do a much better demo of the tool than I just did for you all. And so it might be good to maybe edit that one out. So I'll send Laura and or you those links to those videos.
That's great. Yeah. I think Laura and I are the right people. And then the second question I had is I wanted to ask if you wanted to maybe give a slight preview of how, if you feel comfortable, of how this tool might be used for emergency transportation route case studies. And if you feel comfortable, Carol's not here. Today she's on vacation. Otherwise, I'd put Carol on the spot.
Yeah. So the idea there is to essentially build out some kind of case studies. Part of the idea is to figure out, all right, how do we use this tool? How do we use this data? And so one idea that we came up with is, it has a lot of detailed demographic data in it, which sort of caters itself towards that narrative building piece and understanding more of the nuance of the communities that are in different areas. And so the idea was to build out some sort of case studies of different parts of the region that are sort of demographically significantly different from each other, that are being served by different emergency transportation routes. And as I understand it, sort of the intention of the project is to take those results and potentially sort of bring it back to community. So again, sort of this iterative process of, we started out with the qualitative input, developed some quantitative thresholds, reevaluated with the community, back to the quantitative results, try to use it and make sense of it quantitatively, take it back to the community and get, qualitative feedback and sort of bring it full circle and be like, all right, this is what we think we found about these areas that are being served by these routes. And these are the communities of interest that we think we've identified as being more vulnerable. Does this resonate with your understanding of your constituency and your community? So I think that's sort of where that project is aiming to go.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll just add for everyone, PSU is a partner there on the case study aspect as well. So if you have more questions, we'll probably refer you to Carol when she's back. Thanks, Joe. Bren, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I guess just a clarifying question. When we view emergency routes, we're looking at our high priority streets and roads for, emergency vehicle access, but then those are also what we prioritize for snowplow routes. So I guess I'm trying to understand from the context of this social vulnerability mapping tool, like how the two are merging. Because I mean, are you trying to, I guess, identify who's not being served if we're not prioritizing their road access? I'm just trying to better understand how that data is being used in this context.
I think it's a bit of both. So with those ETRs, I honestly am not quite as familiar with the sort of how the ETRs themselves were developed and what determinations were used for that. But my understanding is that they're specifically regional emergency transportation routes that are geared towards facilitating regional logistical operations. And so, the idea is both, who is proximate to them, for example, in Columbia County, and then, like you said, who perhaps is a little bit further away from those and is maybe not being as well served. So kind of both, like who is it close to, who is it not close to, and then also, relative to different sort of areas of the region, how are those demographics changing? Who's being served in Columbia in the emergency transportation, the tracks adjacent to emergency transportation routes in Columbia County versus who's being served in proximity to the ones in Clackamas or Clark County.
And I'll add that the project, we're not going to be able to look at literally the entire RDPO region, hence the case study aspect. So we'll probably have 3 locations that we focus on, and those are not determined yet. So I hope that helps, but I do think we might have to if you want more information, see if we can connect you with Carol, and if she has any work documentation she could share yet. I just think it's a great example of how this project's already being used to do some planning work.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the last presentation too that I gave this talk at the annual Geographers Conference. A couple folks from NASA showed up specifically for this talk because they're doing a partnership with DPAVE in Portland, Oregon this summer, and they were like, "This is great. Let's see if we can use either the data deliverables themselves or the process that you've developed, which is all scripted out, to sort of look at urban heat specifically and understand potentially some areas that could use more open space in the region." And so that's another example of trying to use either the products or the scripted statistical indexing process that was
cool.
Part of this for another project as well. And the light bulb kind of went off there where I was like, oh yeah, the process was also a deliverable. Like we went through that whole process of developing the quantitative screens and all that kind of thing, and it's like and scripted that whole process out, and it's like, oh, because they were like, you have children under 18 in there, but for urban heat we might be more specifically interested in under 5. And I was like, well, we can just swap that out, and I can just run the script again and see how that changes things.
Let's go.
I'm trying to talk and I'm on mute. Does anybody else have any questions for Joe? Any other questions? All right, I think it's a great idea with the recordings, especially if Joe has some that he really likes, to get those up on the RDPO site so that we can share those with folks when I have people ask me about social vulnerability tool and how do I use that? And I can send them the link for the tool, but I can't really give them Joe's presentation. So.
There's a part of me that just wants to record like a really nice demo just on its own that doesn't have like the screen of like artifacts in there or whatever. And so I was talking about that with the web team of like, it would be fun just to create like the official demo video, and so that may be in the works as well. But for now, I'll share with God and go from there.
Okay, well, keep us posted on that, Joe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming today and giving the presentation again. I'm sure you're presented out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it made me realize, like, I used to not practice as much. Like, I kind of like was like, oh, you don't need to practice, just go present. It's fine. And I teach GIS at Portland Community College, so I'm in presenter mode a lot as well. So I'm like, I can do it, but practicing really does help on presentations. So it sort of reminded me the benefit of, like, doing it a few times. And you do, I think, get better at it. So I'm not presented out. I like doing it. And the presentation did just recently get accepted at the national MPO conference, AMPO, and so that's coming up in September. So I'm looking forward to delivering it to a bunch of MPO folks from around the country.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well,
Awesome.
thanks again.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.